The wind that swept down from the peaks had teeth. It bit at Caleb Thorne's ears and the back of his neck, a cold sharp enough to feel like a physical blow. The train hissed and groaned behind him, a great iron beast panting after its long climb into the high country of the territory. He stepped down from the carriage, his worn boots sinking into a fresh layer of snow that covered the platform of the Willow Bend station. The town was little more than a single street carved into the wilderness, a collection of hardy buildings hunkered down against the vast, white silence of the mountains. A general store, the Silver Bell Saloon with its swinging doors shut tight against the chill, a blacksmith's forge standing dark and quiet behind a livery stable. And farther down, a white-painted church whose steeple seemed to be the only thing brave enough to challenge the height of the surrounding pines. Caleb stood a full head and shoulders above the few men stamping their feet on the platform. At 6 feet and 7 inches, he was accustomed to the initial stares, the quick reassessment in people's eyes as they measured him. He had learned to carry his size with a quiet sort of apology, his shoulders slightly stooped as if to minimize the space he occupied in the world. He clutched the handle of his single carpet bag, its contents everything he owned: a spare set of clothes, his honing tools, and a small, heavy hammer his father had given him. In his pocket, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon felt both warm and heavy, letters smelling faintly of lavender, filled with promises of a home, a wife, a place to belong. A man in a thick woolen coat and a station master's cap bustled toward him. His face was weathered, his mustache dusted with frost. He looked up at Caleb, his eyes crinkling at the corners. His name was Ernest Hadley, the first and only citizen of Willow Bend Caleb was to meet. Ernest offered a gloved hand. Caleb took it, his own large, calloused palm engulfing the station master's. Ernest gave a low whistle, a man used to judging the size of freight. The arrangements had been made. Caleb was to wait here. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore would arrive to collect him. The thought sent a nervous tremor through him. For months, their correspondence had been his only anchor. Her words were precise, her penmanship elegant. She wrote of needing a strong husband to manage her late husband's affairs, to be a respectable presence in the community. She had enclosed a tintype of herself, a handsome woman with her hair pinned in a severe bun, her mouth set in a firm, unsmiling line. He had sent one back, taken by a traveling photographer. He had been seated to lessen his height, but there was no hiding the length of his bones. He had described himself as a blacksmith by trade, strong and in good health. He hoped it was enough. The sound of a sleigh approaching, its bells jingling a crisp tune in the frozen air, drew their attention. A fine black sleigh pulled by a matching pair of horses swept up to the station. The driver, a boy bundled to his eyes in scarves, jumped down to hold the horses steady. From the passenger seat, a woman emerged, Margaret Whitmore. She was exactly as her picture had shown, wrapped in a fur-lined coat that spoke of wealth, her face shielded from the wind by a fine woolen bonnet. She walked with a purpose, her boots making neat, decisive prints in the snow. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the small group on the platform and settled on Caleb. She stopped a few feet away. Her gaze started at his snow-dusted boots, traveled slowly up the length of his legs, past his woolen trousers and simple coat, over his broad chest, and finally, after what felt to Caleb like an eternity, reached his face. Her expression, which had been one of neutral expectation, curdled. Her lips thinned into a line even more severe than in her photograph. The silence on the platform was absolute, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the whine of the wind. Everyone was watching. Margaret Whitmore drew a sharp breath. Her voice, when it came, was not a private whisper. It was clear and cold and carried across the platform for all to hear. "You did not mention you were a giant." The word hung in the air, sharp and ugly as a shard of ice. She did not wait for a reply. She simply turned, her back ramrod straight, and marched back to her sleigh. She said a single word to the driver, who scrambled back into his seat. The whip cracked, the horses lurched forward, and the sleigh slid away. leaving behind nothing but tracks in the snow and a silence thick with humiliation. Then a sound broke the stillness, a low chuckle from one of the men leaning against the station wall. Another joined in, and soon a wave of muffled laughter spread across the platform, a cruel sound that seemed to freeze Caleb's blood. He stood rooted to the spot, his face burning with a shame so hot it felt as if it could melt the snow at his feet. His promised home, his promised life, had vanished in the space of a single, cutting word. He had lost his place before he had even found it. He had lost his dignity in front of an entire town. But as he straightened his shoulders, pulling himself up to his full, formidable height, he knew he had not lost his self. That was a thing no one could take from him. Ernest Hadley cleared his throat, the sound loud in the sudden quiet. The laughter died down as the men shuffled their feet, suddenly unwilling to meet Caleb's eyes. Ernest stepped closer to Caleb, his expression a mixture of pity and anger. That was a foul thing to do. A foul thing. Caleb could only manage a nod, his throat too tight for words. The lavender-scented letters in his pocket now felt like a block of ice against his leg. Ernest looked at the sky, where the clouds were growing heavy and dark. Another storm's coming. You cannot stay out here. My office is warm. Come on, son. Let us get you out of the cold. Caleb followed the station master into the small, blessedly warm station office. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated a comforting heat. Ernest poured 2 cups of coffee from a tin pot, the liquid black and bitter. Caleb wrapped his cold hands around the warm mug, the simple kindness of the gesture almost undoing him. He had nowhere to go. His ticket was one way. The money in his pocket was barely enough for a week's worth of meals, let alone a return journey. The snow was falling again, thick, heavy flakes that were already obscuring the windows. He was stranded. Ernest seemed to read his mind. "The Reverend," he said, after a long silence. "Reverend Thomas Whitaker. He is a good man. The church sometimes takes in folks who are down on their luck. It is not much, but it is a roof." Hope was a dangerous thing, but it was all Caleb had. He nodded. The walk to the church was a trial. The wind had picked up, driving the snow into their faces. People on the street stopped to stare at the giant of a man walking beside their station master. Whispers followed them like the swirling snow. "The man misses." Whitmore sent back. "Too tall," they said. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the church steeple, a white finger pointing toward a gray heaven. The church was cold inside, the air still and smelling of old wood and hymn books. Reverend Thomas Whitaker was in his study, a small man with kind eyes and a fringe of white hair around a bald head. He listened patiently as Ernest explained the situation, his gaze resting on Caleb with a gentle curiosity that held no judgment. When Ernest was finished, the Reverend looked at Caleb. He saw the worn clothes, the calloused hands of a man who worked hard, the deep ache of humiliation in his eyes. "There is a small storeroom out back," the Reverend said, his voice soft. "It is dry, and we can put a cot in there for you. But the church has little money. We cannot offer charity." Caleb's head came up. "I do not want charity. I want work." A small smile touched the Reverend's lips. "Good. The Lord helps those who help themselves. And as it happens, the Lord's house is in need of some help. The stove in the main hall does not draw right, fills the room with smoke. The bell rope is frayed, nearly worn through, and there is a leak in the roof of the vestry. Small things, perhaps, but they require a skilled hand." Caleb felt a flicker of something he had not felt since stepping off the train purpose. These were problems he could solve. These were things he could fix with his hands. He could take the stovepipe apart, clean it, and refit it. He could splice a new rope. He could climb to the roof and replace the shingles. "I am a blacksmith," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But I can work with wood and stone, too. I can fix those things for you." Reverend Whitaker nodded slowly. "Then it is settled. You can work for your keep, a trade, your labor for our shelter. It is an honorable arrangement." As Caleb followed the Reverend to the small, cold storeroom that would be his new home, he felt the town's unwritten rules closing in. Willow Bend was a place that measured a man by a mold, his height, his origins. The whispers that trailed behind him, these were the tools they used. He could not help but wonder, was he truly just a thing for people to point at and mock? The question settled deep in his gut. A cold, heavy stone, but on top of it, another feeling began to take root, the familiar discipline of work. A job needed doing. He would do it. That night, on a narrow cot in the dusty storeroom, Caleb listened to the wind howl outside. The snow was piling up, burying the world, burying the promises that had brought him here. The cold seeped through the wooden walls, a deep, penetrating chill that reminded him of the cold stove in the church hall, a stove that needed a skilled hand to make it burn hot and bright again, to bring warmth back to a cold space. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bundle of letters. He untied the ribbon, in the dim light of a single candle. He looked at Margaret Whitmore's elegant, precise script one last time. He did not read the words. He knew them by heart. He took the letters, one by one, and fed them into the small brazier he had found in the corner, which he had filled with a few precious lumps of coal from the church's supply. The lavender-scented paper caught fire, curling into black ash. The flame was small, but it was warm. He watched until the last letter was gone. The promises turned to dust as thin and fragile as his old hopes. The wind rattled the door, as if trying to get in. Caleb lay back on the cot, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. If a door closes, he thought, his eyes heavy with a weariness that went beyond the bones. Perhaps it is to open another. He did not know what door that might be, but for the first time that day, he allowed himself to believe it might exist. The first task was the stove. Caleb spent the morning taking the flue apart, section by section. It was clogged with a thick, greasy soot, the buildup of years of neglect. He worked methodically, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small brushes and scraping tools he borrowed from the reverend. But the damper was warped, a piece of cast iron bent out of shape by too much heat and a sudden cold draft. It would need to be straightened, and that required a proper forge. Reverend Whitaker directed him to the blacksmith shop behind the livery. It was an old, timber-framed building, its walls stained dark with smoke. The scent of coal, hot metal, and horse hung heavy in the air. Inside, an old man was hunched over the anvil, his arm rising and falling with a slow, pained rhythm. This was Hugh Morrison. He was a man made of sinew and bone, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands gnarled and swollen at the knuckles. He stopped his work as Caleb's shadow fell over him, his head tilting back to take in the sheer size of the man filling his doorway. Hugh squinted. "The Reverend sent you, said you needed a fire." Caleb nodded. "The damper on the church stove is warped. I need to heat it and true it up." Hugh grunted, wiping a hand on his leather apron. "A forge is not a public hearth. It is a craftsman's tool. You know how to use one. I was apprenticed to my father. He was a ship's smith." "A ship's smith," Hugh repeated, a flicker of interest in his pale eyes. "That is close work, fine work, not just banging on horseshoes." He gestured with his hammer toward a pile of scrap iron near the hearth. "Show me. Make me a pair of fire tongs, and a set of andirons, simple ones, but make them clean. If your work has a soul, you can use my fire." It was a test. Caleb understood. He took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and set to work. He moved with an economy of motion that belied his size. He chose the stock, measured it with his eye, and thrust it into the glowing heart of the forge. He worked the bellows with a steady, powerful rhythm, his gaze fixed on the iron, watching for the precise moment it reached the bright cherry red of perfect malleability. When he pulled it from the fire, he did not rush. He laid the glowing metal on the anvil and his hammer began to sing. It was not the pained, hesitant beat of the old man's work. It was a clear, ringing music, a swift series of blows to draw out the metal, a turn of the wrist, a precise tap to shape the joint, another to form the handle. He worked as if the hammer were an extension of his own arm, his focus absolute. Hugh Morrison stood back, his arms crossed, watching in silence. Caleb finished the tongs first, plunging them into the quenching tub with a loud hiss. They were simple, functional, but the lines were clean, the balance perfect. He did not rest. He started on the andirons, his design a simple, sturdy shepherd's crook that was both handsome and practical. He added a small, almost invisible flourish at the base, a hammered twist that caught the light. It was a maker's mark, a small piece of himself left in the iron. When he was done, he laid the finished pieces on a workbench, the tongs, the andirons, and the now perfectly straight damper from the church stove. They were still warm to the touch. Hugh picked up one of the andirons. Turning it over in his gnarled hands, he ran a thumb over the smooth, hammered finish. He looked from the iron to Caleb, and for the first time, his expression softened. "My hands," he said, holding them up. "The cold gets in the bones. Some days, I cannot hold a hammer proper." He set the andiron down. "You can use the forge. In return, when my hands are bad, you will help with my orders." Caleb felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a fair bargain. It was respect, earned with skill. He agreed without hesitation. His first Sunday in Willow Bend was an ordeal. He sat in a back pew, his long legs crammed into the narrow space. He was acutely aware of every head that turned, every set of eyes that lingered on him. He could feel their gazes like physical touches, measuring him, judging him. The whispers were a low buzz, like insects in the summer heat. The giant, the one misses. Whitmore turned away. He kept his eyes on Reverend Whitaker at the pulpit, his jaw set. The Reverend's sermon that day was on the parable of the Good Samaritan. He spoke of mercy and compassion, but then he veered from the familiar text. He spoke of how communities build walls, not with stone, but with judgment, how they create false measures for a person's worth, using the yardsticks of wealth or family name. Or even, he said, his eyes sweeping over the congregation, the simple fact of how a man is built. True justice, the Reverend preached, is not about fitting people into neat and tidy boxes. It is about making room in our hearts for those who are different, for those who are hurting. Caleb felt the words land like a balm on his bruised spirit. He did not know if the Reverend had aimed the sermon at him, but it felt like a shield, a quiet defense offered in a public place. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the cold sunshine, Caleb hung back, not wanting to run the gauntlet of stairs again. As he stood near the door, a woman approached him. She was of average height, with dark hair pulled back from a plain but intelligent face. Her clothes were simple but well kept. What he noticed first, however, was her left hand. It rested on the hymnal she carried, and the back of it was covered in a pale, ropey scar, the skin pulled tight and shiny. She stopped in front of him, her gaze direct and steady. It was a strange and welcome feeling. She was not looking up at a giant. She was looking at a man. "My name is Ruth Callahan," she said. Her voice was calm and clear. "Caleb Thorne," he replied, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. "I know. I was here on Thursday." She did not elaborate, but he knew she meant the station. What Margaret Whitmore did was wrong. It was cruel and it was small-minded. The bluntness of her statement took him by surprise. He had been expecting pity or awkward silence. He had not expected such a clear and simple declaration of justice. He did not know what to say. She held out a basket she was carrying. It was covered with a clean linen cloth. "I did too much baking yesterday. I cannot possibly eat all this myself. There is bread, some apple jam, and a piece of cheese. It is no good letting it go to waste." Her excuse was so transparent it was almost comical, but her face was perfectly serious. She was offering him a gift but trying to strip it of any hint of charity, giving him an excuse to accept it without feeling like a beggar. He looked down at the basket, then back at her. He saw the scar on her hand, and suddenly he understood something about her. She knew what it was like to be marked, to be looked at and seen only for the thing that was different about you. He reached out and took the basket. The bread inside was still warm, its heat seeping through the wicker and into his cold fingers. It felt like life. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan," That is very kind." "It is nothing," she said with a small shrug, "just a neighborly gesture." He saw other people from the church glancing their way, including Martha and Samuel Boone, a sturdy farming couple who gave him a brief, shy smile. An older woman with kind eyes and the fine features of a Chinese woman who he later learned was Mrs. Chen from the laundry gave him a slow, deliberate nod of encouragement. Not everyone in Willow Bend was like Margaret Whitmore. Ruth Callahan seemed ready to leave, but then she paused. She looked at him again, her expression serious. He had the feeling she was seeing right through the wall he had built around himself. "Do not let this town make you small, Mr. Thorne." And with that, she turned and walked away, her footsteps sure and steady on the snow-packed ground. Caleb stood frozen in the doorway of the church, the warm basket in his hands. Her words echoed in his mind. "Do not let this town make you small." It was a strange thing to say to a man of his size, but he knew, with a sudden, piercing clarity, that she was not talking about his height. She was talking about his spirit. For the first time since he had arrived in this cold, judgmental place, he felt as if someone had looked at him, truly looked, and seen him at eye level. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of work and quiet observation, with the stove drawing perfectly, its warmth now a welcoming presence in the church hall. Caleb turned his attention to the other tasks. The frayed bell rope was a simple fix, but it required him to climb into the belfry. He ascended the narrow, dusty ladder, his broad shoulders brushing the walls. At the top, in the small, open-aired chamber with the great bronze bell, he paused. From this high vantage, Willow Bend was laid out below him like a miniature. He could see the entire length of the main street, the plume of smoke rising from Hugh Morrison's forge, the neat houses with their snow-covered roofs, and the dark ribbon of the river winding through the valley. The people moving below were small, their concerns and their judgments seeming to shrink with the distance. He saw Margaret Whitmore's fine sleigh pass the general store, a tiny black speck in the vast whiteness. From up here, she was not an arbiter of his fate. She was just another piece on a board. He realized the town was like a chessboard, with its own set of rigid rules about how each piece could move. For the first time, he felt a sense of detachment, a feeling that he did not have to be defined by the rules of their small game. He could simply exist outside of it, a player of his own making. He replaced the rope, his hands sure and steady as he spliced the thick new hemp, his mind calm. The work was honest. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was a language he understood far better than the whispers and stares of the people below. Ruth Callahan began to visit the church with a surprising frequency. Her excuses were always practical and slightly flimsy. One afternoon she arrived with a small hand drill, claiming she needed to borrow a finer bit for a cabinet repair. Caleb, who was mending a loose floorboard near the altar, knew she owned a full set of bits. He played along, carefully selecting one from the Reverend's toolbox and wiping it clean before handing it to her. She thanked him, her expression perfectly earnest. As she turned to leave, she paused. "That is a fine mortise you are cutting, Mr. Thorne, clean and square." He looked up from his work. "My father taught me that the small, unseen things are what hold a structure together. A good joint, a well-placed nail." She nodded, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "I suppose that is true of more than just wood." She left without another word, leaving him with the pleasant feeling of being seen not as an object of curiosity but as a fellow craftsman. Another day she brought him a cup of hot broth in a tin, insisting she had made far too much for her own supper. The wind was particularly sharp that day, and the rich, savory warmth of the broth was a welcome comfort. They stood in the shelter of the church porch, talking for a few minutes. Their conversations were never about his past or her own. They spoke of the weather, of the quality of the local timber, of the stubbornness of the mountain soil. He learned she kept a small garden and was already planning her spring planting. "She has a patch of early peas," she told him, a small smile playing on her lips. "They are the first green things to show, so determined. They push right up through the last of the snow, as if to remind the winter its time is over." He found himself looking forward to her visits, to their easy, unburdened conversation. It was a quiet space in a world that was often too loud with judgment. The whispers about him had not stopped. They were a constant, low hum in the background of his life in Willow Bend, but other, kinder voices were beginning to emerge. One evening, as he was cleaning up at the forge, Samuel Boone approached him. He and his wife Martha had been among the few who had smiled at him that first Sunday. "My wife, Martha, she sent me," Samuel said, twisting his hat in his hands. "She says a man who works as hard as you do deserves a proper hot meal. We would be honored if you would join us for supper tonight." The invitation was so unexpected that Caleb was momentarily speechless. He accepted, his voice gruff with emotion. The Boone's small farmhouse was filled with the smell of roasting chicken and baking bread. It was a simple meal, but it was offered with a genuine warmth that filled a deep hunger within him. They asked him about his blacksmithing, their questions full of honest curiosity about his craft, not his size. For those few hours, he was not the mail-order husband who was sent back. He was Caleb Thorne, a man with a skill, a guest at their table. A few days later, Mrs. Chen from the laundry came to the forge. She carried a carefully drawn sketch on a piece of brown paper. She wanted a new set of hinges for a cedar chest her husband had built for her, but she did not want plain hinges. Her drawing showed an intricate design of a bamboo stalk, its leaves gracefully unfurled. "It requires a delicate hand," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Hugh's hands are not steady enough anymore. I have seen your work on the church stove. You have a delicate hand." Caleb studied the drawing. It was a beautiful, challenging design. He spent the next 2 days at the forge, a good deal of the time helping Hugh with a wagon wheel repair. But stealing moments to work on the hinges, he forgot about everything else, losing himself in the task of heating, hammering, and shaping the iron into the delicate forms of leaf and stalk. When he was finished, he had created a small masterpiece. Mrs. Chen was delighted. She paid him what he knew was more than a fair price, pressing the coins into his hand with a quiet dignity that allowed him to accept them without shame. It was the first money he had earned in Willow Bend. He was no longer just working for his keep. He was a contributing craftsman. He was becoming useful. One afternoon, as he and Ruth sat on the church steps sharing a cup of water from the pump, he found himself telling her something he had never told anyone else. "When I was a boy," he said, his gaze on the distant mountains, "I used to pray I would stop growing. I would lie in bed at night and try to wish myself smaller. I just wanted to fit, to not have people stare all the time." Ruth was silent for a long moment, her eyes on the scarred back of her own hand. Then she looked at him, her gaze clear and unflinching. "You cannot earn acceptance by making yourself smaller, Caleb. You only earn it by being exactly who you are. The right people will see that. The others do not matter." Her words were like a key turning in a lock deep inside him. He had spent his whole life trying to shrink, to apologize for the space he took up. She was telling him to stand tall. As the weeks passed and the snow began to recede from the lower slopes, a new topic of conversation began to circulate through the town. The bell tower at the Willow Bend orphanage. It was an old structure, built of wood, and it had fallen into a dangerous state of disrepair. The winter storms had weakened it further, and now it listed to one side like a tired old man. Reverend Whitaker mentioned it one afternoon, his face etched with worry. Miss Brennan, who ran the orphanage, was afraid to let the children play in the yard beside it for fear it might collapse. The town council called a meeting in the general store to discuss the problem. The store was crowded that evening, the air thick with the smell of kerosene, coffee, and damp wool. Caleb stood at the back, listening. The debate was heated but circular. Everyone agreed the tower was a danger. Everyone agreed it needed to be taken down and rebuilt, but the town's coffers were nearly empty. "We cannot afford to hire a builder from Denver," the mayor said, a portly man named Henderson, "and there is no one here with the skill to take on such a job." Hugh Morrison was there, his old bones aching in the damp air. He spoke up, his voice reedy but clear. It is more than just a carpenter's job. That tower needs a solid frame, with joints that will hold against the wind. It needs a smith's knowledge of stress and structure. A sense of gloomy resignation settled over the room. There was no money. There was no one with the right skills. They would have to rope it off and pray it did not fall on anyone. A silence fell over the crowded store, and in that silence, a deep voice rumbled from the back of the room. "I will do it." Every head turned. Caleb Thorne stepped forward from the shadows. The crowd parted for him as he walked to the center of the room. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, but for the first time, he did not flinch from their gaze. "I will rebuild the tower. I will not take a wage for my labor. All I ask is that the town provides the materials at cost." The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence filled with shock, with disbelief, and with a dawning, reluctant respect. The men who had laughed at him on the station platform, the women who had whispered behind their hands, the entire town that had judged him and found him wanting. All of them stared at the oversized man who had just offered to save their children from harm. He stood before them, not as a giant but as a builder. The morning light was thin and sharp when Caleb arrived at the orphanage. He had expected to be alone, to spend the first day dismantling the rotten timbers by himself. Instead, he found a small group of men waiting for him, their breath pluming in the cold air. Hugh Morrison was there, leaning on a stout cane, his eyes sharp and critical. Samuel Boone stood beside a wagon already loaded with fresh pine beams, his solid presence a quiet statement of support. A young farmer named Jack Miller was there, and a gangly youth of about 17 with eager eyes and calloused hands, who introduced himself as Daniel, Hugh's sometime apprentice. They had not been asked to come. They had simply shown up. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. He nodded to the men, a gesture of gratitude too deep for words. "All right then," he said, his voice steady. "Let us begin." Work was a balm. The clean scent of sawdust, the heft of a hammer, the satisfying groan of old wood giving way, it was a language of purpose and creation, under Hugh's watchful eye. Caleb directed the men. He was a natural leader, not through command, but through competence. His decisions were swift and sure. He knew exactly where to place the levers to pry the old beams loose, how to brace the remaining structure to keep it from collapsing. The men worked, and as they did, a small crowd gathered at a safe distance. The children from the orphanage pressed against the fence, their faces a mix of awe and excitement as they watched the rotted tower come down piece by piece. Around mid-morning, Ruth Callahan arrived. She was not carrying a small basket this time, but a large one, heavy with fresh bread, a wheel of cheese, and a steaming jug of coffee. She set it down on a makeshift table of planks and sawhorses, but she did not leave. She poured coffee for the men, then stood beside Caleb as he unrolled his rough sketches on the table. He explained the design, his large finger tracing the lines he had drawn with a piece of charcoal, a 20-foot tower, built of pine. The joints would be mortise and tenon, pegged for strength. The base would be cross-braced to withstand the mountain winds. And the roof, he said, pointing to the top, it will be sheathed in copper. A man in Denver who owed the Reverend a favor is donating the sheets and the bell. Ruth listened, her head tilted, her questions sharp and intelligent. What about the foundation? Will you set new footings? How will you raise the main posts? He found himself explaining the intricacies of the structure to her, impressed by her quick grasp of the mechanics. She was not just being polite, she was genuinely interested in the work, in the craft of it. The day wore on, a symphony of sawing, hammering, and the shouts of men. By late afternoon, the old tower was gone, its rotten wood piled up to be burned. The ground was cleared. The new foundation stones were set, and the 4 massive corner posts lay on the ground, their joints perfectly cut, ready to be raised. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks, casting long shadows and bathing the valley in a honey-gold light, Caleb climbed the temporary work platform they had built. It was about 10 feet off the ground, a sturdy scaffold from which they would assemble the frame. He stood there for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow, looking out over the town. He heard a sound below him and looked down. It was Ruth, her hand on the ladder, her foot on the first rung. She looked up at him, a hesitant expression on her face. "Is it safe?" she asked. "As a church pew," he answered, offering a hand. She began to climb, her movements careful and deliberate. When she reached the top, her knuckles were white where she gripped the railing. She avoided looking down, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Caleb stood beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring wall. He did not touch her, but she was aware of him, of his quiet strength standing between her and the empty space. "It is beautiful from up here," she said, her voice a little breathless. "The whole town. It looks so peaceful." They stood in silence for a long time, watching as the lights began to flicker on in the small houses below. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of a dog barking. It was a moment of shared peace, high above the gossip and the judgment of the world. The moment was broken by a voice from the ground below. It was a sharp, condescending voice that carried clearly in the still air. Well, it seems the giant has found himself an admirer." Caleb stiffened. He recognized the voice. It belonged to Constance Porter, a woman who was Margaret Whitmore's closest friend and the town's most tireless gossip. She stood near the orphanage fence, her arms crossed, a smug smirk on her face. Ruth did not flinch. She simply looked down, her expression calm. She did not raise her voice, but she spoke with a crystalline clarity that seemed to cut through the evening air and reach every ear in the vicinity. He was a mail-order husband, Mrs. Porter, who was rejected for being too tall. That is the story you all like to tell, but it seems it took another woman to show him that real love is not about finding someone who fits a particular size. It is about seeing a man for the true measure of his character. Constance's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned outrage. A few other townspeople who had been lingering nearby fell silent, their eyes wide. Ruth had taken their mean-spirited little story and turned it back on them, exposing its pettiness. She had not only defended Caleb, she had declared her own standard of worth, a standard that had nothing to do with height or station. On the platform, the world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them. The golden light of the setting sun framed Ruth's face, catching the fire in her dark hair. Caleb looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a kind woman, but a fierce and courageous one. He started, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. Ruth turned to him, her eyes soft in the fading light. "I like you, Caleb Thorne. I like the man you are." The admission was simple, direct, and devastatingly honest. He felt his own carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. He had never been liked for the man he was. He had been measured, used, pitied, or feared, never simply liked. "I like you too, Ruth Callahan," he managed to say, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate but utterly true. She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that seemed to light her from within. And then, in the cool mountain air, high above the town, she leaned in, and he met her halfway. Their first kiss was not one of passion, but of quiet discovery. It was gentle, hesitant, and warm against the chill of the evening. It tasted of coffee and sawdust and the promise of something new and real. It was a kiss that sealed a silent pact, a recognition that they were two lonely souls who had, against all odds, found a place to stand together. When they finally drew apart, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Below them, Constance Porter had stormed off, but others remained, watching them with a new, uncertain respect. The children of the orphanage were still at the fence, their small faces filled with a silent, hopeful wonder. Later that night, as Caleb walked Ruth to her small cottage at the edge of town, they walked under a blanket of stars. The air was cold and clean. At her gate, she turned to him. "Tomorrow night," she said, her voice soft in the darkness. "Have dinner at my house. No more ladders, just the two of us." Caleb looked down at her, the starlight catching in her eyes, a real smile, broad and unburdened, spread across his face for the first time since he had come to Willow Bend. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I would like that very much." The door to Ruth's cottage opened into a world of warmth and soft light. The main room was small but tidy, filled with the scent of roasted potatoes and something sweet, like baked apples. A fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing on the polished wood of a simple dining table set for two. It was a space that felt lived in, a home built not for show, but for comfort. Caleb had to duck his head to enter, but once inside, the room did not feel small. It felt right. They ate in a comfortable silence at first, the clink of their forks against the plates the only sound besides the fire. The food was simple and delicious, but it was the quiet companionship that nourished Caleb most. After months of eating alone in his cold storeroom or taking quick meals at the forge, sharing a table with her felt like a profound luxury. She watched him across the table, a small, curious smile on her lips. "You have your father's hands." The observation was so unexpected it startled him. "I suppose I do. They are a blacksmith's hands." "He was a ship's smith," Caleb found himself saying, the words coming easily. "We lived on the coast. He worked in the shipyards, forging anchors and chains, things that had to be strong enough to hold against the sea. He used to say that a smith does not just shape iron, he gives it a purpose. He taught me to read the metal, to know when it was ready to yield. He was a quiet man, but his hammer spoke for him." He fell silent, lost in the memory. Ruth did not rush him. She simply waited, her patient gaze an invitation to continue. "He died when I was 16, Caleb said, his voice low. "The work, it was all I had left of him. It is how I have made my way since." "And your mother?" Ruth asked gently. "She passed when I was young. I do not remember her well, just the feel of her hand on my forehead when I had a fever." Ruth nodded slowly, her eyes filled with an understanding that needed no words. He saw in that moment that she was not just listening to his story. She was hearing the loneliness between the lines. "My husband, Daniel, was a good man," she said, her voice soft as she looked into the fire. "He was a surveyor, quiet, steady. Our life together was calm. But it was not a life of shared feelings. We lived alongside each other, not with each other. It was an arrangement of mutual respect, not a union of hearts. I was fond of him, but I was not in love with him. It is a lonely thing to admit. Even now." Caleb listened, his heart aching for the quiet sorrow in her confession. He understood it completely. He had sought an arrangement, a marriage of practicality, and had been rejected for it. She had lived one. They had both been looking for a place to belong, a home for their hearts. The work on the tower took another 2 weeks. It rose steadily, a skeleton of golden pine against the blue mountain sky. Caleb was no longer just the giant, the outcast. He was the builder. Men who had once averted their eyes now sought his opinion on timber and tools. Women who had whispered behind their hands now sent their children with offerings of biscuits and lemonade for the work crew. He was the same man, but the town's way of seeing him had changed. He had not shrunk to fit their mold. He had built something so large and so undeniably good that they had been forced to change their perspective. The final day was clear and bright. The copper sheathing on the roof gleamed in the sun. The last task was to hoist the new bell into place. It was a celebration. The entire town seemed to be there, their faces turned upward. Miss Brennan stood with the orphans, their hands linked, their eyes wide with wonder. With a system of ropes and pulleys Caleb had devised, the men on the ground slowly hauled the heavy bronze bell up the side of the tower. Caleb was at the top, waiting, guiding it into its housing. When it was finally secured, a ragged cheer went up from the crowd below. He attached the new rope and gave it a tentative pull. The first chime was clear and true, a single, perfect note that rolled across the valley. Then he let the orphans take over. They tugged on the rope with joyous abandon, and the bell began to sing, its voice ringing out over Willow Bend, a sound of renewal, of community, of a promise kept. Caleb stood on the platform, his work complete, and listened to the music he had helped create. It was not a diploma, but it felt like one. It was the sound of his acceptance. A few days later, he was helping Ruth in her garden. The spring thaw had finally come, and the dark, rich earth was ready for planting. They worked side by side, turning the soil, their hands sinking into the cool dirt. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. He watched her as she carefully placed seeds into a furrow, her movements efficient and full of a quiet grace. The scar on her hand was stark against the dark soil, a testament to her courage. He was overcome with a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees, a deep, abiding love for this strong, practical, beautiful woman. He was trying to find the words, to assemble the right phrases to tell her what was in his heart, when she straightened up, wiping a smear of dirt from her cheek with the back of her forearm. She looked at him, her gaze as direct and honest as always. "I want a future with you, Caleb," she said, her voice steady. "Right now, I am not getting any younger, and I have spent enough of my life being patient. I want to build a life with you, starting today." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of intent. It was a proposal. Ruth's way, no kneeling, no poetry, just the plain, unvarnished truth offered up in a muddy garden. He stepped toward her, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He cupped her face in his large, dirt-stained hands. A slow smile spread across his face, and he began to laugh, a deep, joyful sound that came from the very core of him. She laughed too, a bright, happy sound. He lowered his head and kissed her, a long, heartfelt kiss that tasted of earth and sunshine and the promise of a shared future. When they parted, his cheek was smudged with the same dirt that marked hers. The following Sunday, the church was fuller than usual. A buzz of anticipation hung in the air. Caleb sat beside Ruth in her usual pew, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on Reverend Whitaker. He felt the familiar weight of the town's eyes upon him, but today it was different. He was not an outsider on display. He was a man sitting next to the woman he loved. After the final hymn, the Reverend cleared his throat. "Before I give the benediction," he said, his eyes twinkling, "I have a joyful announcement to make. By the grace of God and their own choosing, Caleb Thorne and Ruth Callahan have declared their intention to be joined in holy matrimony." A wave of sound washed over the sanctuary. There was a swell of applause from the Boones, from Mrs. Chen, from Ernest Hadley and his wife. There were smiles and nods and warm murmurs of approval, but there was also a countercurrent of sharp, indrawn breaths and disapproving whispers. Then, from a pew near the front, a figure rose. It was Margaret Whitmore. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Without a backward glance, she swept down the aisle and out the heavy oak doors, which swung shut behind her with a final, definitive thud. Her friend, Constance Porter, hurried after her. The sanctuary fell silent for a moment, the division in the town laid bare for all to see. Then Reverend Whitaker smiled. "Let us pray," he said. After the service, Caleb and Ruth stepped out into the churchyard. A warm breeze, the first true breath of summer, stirred the leaves on the cottonwood trees. The anger and the judgment inside the church seemed to fade in the bright sunshine. He looked down at her, at the quiet strength in her profile, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He had been a drifter, a man without an anchor, for so long. He had come to this town seeking a harbor and had been turned away, but he had found something better. He had found a home. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "I am staying," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "I am not leaving." Their wedding was not a grand affair. The church was not filled with expensive flowers, but with buckets of wild columbine and Indian paintbrush that Ruth and the older orphan girls had gathered from the mountain meadows. The pews were filled with the people who had come to matter: the Boones, Mrs. Chen and her husband, Ernest Hadley, Hugh Morrison leaning heavily on his cane, and in the very front row, the scrubbed and shining faces of the children from the orphanage. They were the guests of honor. Ruth wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, a color that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes. She had embroidered a delicate vine of ivy leaves around the collar and cuffs, a touch of her own patient artistry. Caleb stood beside her at the altar, feeling impossibly large and out of place in the holy space, yet more grounded than he had ever been in his life. He wore a new suit of dark gray wool, the first set of clothes he had ever owned that had been made just for him. A tailor in Denver had taken his measurements, and for the first time, the sleeves were long enough, the shoulders did not pinch, and the trousers did not end inches above his ankles. It was a strange and wonderful feeling to be clothed in something that did not fight his own shape but accommodated it, to feel for once perfectly fitted to his own skin. Reverend Whitaker did not deliver a long sermon. He spoke simply and from the heart. Love, he told them, looking from Caleb's earnest face to Ruth's quiet one, is not a feeling that arrives fully formed. It is a choice we make every day. It is the choice to be kind when you are tired, to be patient when you are tested, to see the best in each other when the world shows you its worst. It is a home you build together, plank by plank, nail by nail, a shelter against the storms. You have both already proven you are fine builders. Their vows were simple and direct, promises whispered in the quiet church. Then the Reverend smiled. I now pronounce you husband and wife. A cheer, led by the orphans, erupted in the small sanctuary. The reception was held in the church hall, the same hall where Caleb had first repaired the smoky stove. The long tables were laden with food brought by the guests, Martha Boone's roasted chickens, Mrs. Chen's sweet almond cakes, pies and breads and stews from a dozen other kitchens. Someone had brought a fiddle, and a lively tune soon filled the room. Samuel Boone called for the first dance. Caleb looked at Ruth in a panic. He had never danced in his life. His size had always made it an exercise in awkwardness and tripping. She just smiled, took his large hand in hers, and led him to the center of the floor. He moved stiffly, his feet feeling like clumsy blocks of wood, his long arms unsure of where to go. Ruth moved with a simple, easy grace, ignoring his missteps, her eyes laughing up at him. Just walk with the music. Caleb, she whispered. That is all it is. He focused on her face, on the joy he saw there, and slowly, his body began to relax. He was still clumsy, still a giant trying to navigate a space made for smaller men. But for the first time, his awkwardness was not a source of shame. It was a shared joke, a moment of gentle humor between him and his wife. Later, sitting at a small table away from the crowd, Hugh Morrison beckoned Caleb over. The old blacksmith's eyes were rheumy but sharp. That tower, he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. That was good work, honest work. My hands are done. The forge needs a young man's strength, a true smith's heart. He paused, taking a sip of whiskey. I am proposing a partnership. You do the heavy work. I will handle the books as long as I am able. When I am gone, it is yours. Caleb was stunned into silence. He had hoped, one day, to perhaps save enough to rent the forge, to be offered a partnership, to be given a legacy, was more than he had ever dared to dream. He looked at Hugh, at the tired lines on the old man's face, and saw not just a business offer, but a passing of the torch. He accepted, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude. As the party wound down and the guests began to drift home, Caleb and Ruth walked back to her cottage under a sky littered with stars. Her cottage, their cottage now. The word home had a new weight, a new meaning. Inside, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The small room was quiet, a peaceful haven after the noise and celebration. He was nervous, his hands feeling large and clumsy again. This was a different kind of intimacy, one not of hammers and wood, but of whispers and trust. Ruth seemed to sense his unease. She came and stood before him, taking his large hands in her own. She lifted his right hand and placed it against her cheek, her skin soft and warm. Then she took his other hand, the left one, and held it in both of hers, her fingers gently tracing the calluses and the old burn scars from the forge. She did not say a word. She simply looked at him, her eyes full of a deep and unconditional acceptance. In that quiet gaze, his fear dissolved. He was not a giant here. He was not an outcast. He was just Caleb, her husband. He reached up and, with a touch as gentle as he could manage, he began to remove the pins from her hair. It fell around her shoulders in a dark, soft wave, and he ran his fingers through it, marveling at its texture. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. He saw the vulnerability in her face, the complete trust she was placing in him, and his heart swelled with a fierce, protective love. Their wedding night was not a whirlwind of passion, but a slow, quiet discovery. It was made of whispered conversations in the firelight, of sharing the small, secret histories of their scars, both the visible one on her hand and the invisible ones on his heart. It was in the gentle, careful way he touched her, as if she were made of something precious and fine. And it was in the profound sense of safety she felt, allowing herself to be held by a strength that was not a threat, but a promise of protection. In the quiet darkness of their new bedroom, they found not an escape, but a beginning, a place where two lonely people finally, truly came home. Life settled into a new and comfortable rhythm. Their days were a quiet dance of shared responsibilities. Caleb would rise before dawn and head to the forge, the ring of his hammer on the anvil becoming a familiar morning song for the town. Ruth would work in her garden, her hands in the earth, or spend her hours in the kitchen, bottling the fruits of her labor. They were separate in their work, but always connected. Hugh Morrison was true to his word. He taught Caleb the art of bookkeeping, of ordering supplies, of dealing with the specific needs of the local ranchers and farmers. He was passing on not just a business, but the intricate knowledge of a community. One evening, Caleb came home with a set of drawings. "I was thinking," he said, spreading them on the kitchen table, "we could use a proper workshop. Here. A place for me to do woodworking. Repairs. Something quieter than the forge." He pointed to a patch of ground beside the cottage. Ruth studied the drawings, her practical eye taking in every detail. "It is a good plan," she said, "but you will not be building it alone." And so, in the long evenings of early summer, they built the workshop together. He set the heavy foundation stones and raised the frame, his great strength making the work look easy. She worked beside him, learning to saw a straight line, to drive a nail true. Their laughter and the rhythmic sound of their two hammers, one heavy and one light, filled the twilight air. It was a small building, but it changed the shape of their home, making it larger, more complete. The cottage was no longer just hers, it was theirs, a place they were actively creating together. The day they finished the roof, Caleb held up the final, hand-forged rivet. He had made it himself, with a small heart stamped into its head. He drove it into the main crossbeam, its sharp bang echoing in the completed space. It was the final anchor, the point that held everything together. Months passed. The vibrant greens of summer faded to the gold and rust of autumn. The first snows began to dust the high peaks, a warning of the winter to come. One night, a fierce blizzard swept down from the mountains, a howling gale of wind and snow that rattled the windows and shook the small cottage. But inside, the fire burned bright in the hearth. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the room with a rich, savory scent. Caleb sat in a chair he had built, mending a piece of leather harness. Ruth was across from him, reading a book, her feet tucked up beneath her. The storm raged outside, a wild and untamed force, but in their small circle of firelight, there was only warmth and peace and a profound sense of safety. Ruth closed her book and looked at him, her eyes soft in the flickering light. She reached across and placed her hand on his arm. He looked up, and she smiled, a slow, contented smile. "This is home," she whispered. The deep cold of winter locked Willow Bend in its grip. With it came a sickness. It began as a cough in the saloon, a fever at the general store, but it spread with the merciless speed of a wildfire through dry grass. The influenza, the town doctor called it, a familiar and dreaded winter guest. In the close confines of the small, snowbound town, it found fertile ground. Soon, There was not a family left untouched by the rasping coughs, the aching bones, and the terrifying, consuming fevers. Ruth, who had nursed her own family through a similar outbreak years before, did not hesitate. Caleb watched, his heart a cold knot of fear, as she packed a bag with clean linens, dried herbs for teas, and strong-smelling poultices. "You cannot," he said, his voice rough with anxiety. "It is too dangerous." She turned to him, her face calm and resolute. "And who will help these people? Caleb Dr. Adams is run off his feet. Martha Boone is doing what she can, but she has her own little ones to worry about. These are our neighbors. I know how to bring a fever down. I know how to make a body comfortable. I cannot sit here by the fire while people are suffering. It is not in my nature." He saw the unshakable conviction in her eyes, the same quiet strength that had first drawn him to her. He could not forbid her. He could only stand at the door and watch her walk out into the snow. A small, determined figure on her way to fight a battle he could not help her with. His own battle began a few days later. A knock came at the forge door. It was Samuel Boone, his face grim. "It is old John Hemlock, the rancher from up the valley. He is gone. We need a box. Caleb." Caleb's hands, which could shape hot iron with such precision, felt clumsy and useless. He had never built a coffin before, but he nodded, took the measurements Samuel had scribbled on a piece of paper, and set to work. He used good pine, cutting the boards with care, making the joints clean and tight. It was honest work, but it was work filled with a profound sorrow. 2 days later, another order came, and then another. The sound of his hammer, once the town's morning song, now became a somber drumbeat, marking the toll the sickness was taking. He worked with a grim efficiency, his face a mask of stone. The hardest day came when Miss Brennan appeared at the workshop, her face swollen from crying, her small frame trembling. "It is little Emma," she whispered, her voice breaking. The fever took her in the night. She was only 7. A cold hand squeezed Caleb's heart. He remembered Emma, a bright little girl with a gap-toothed smile who had watched the building of the bell tower with wide, adoring eyes. He looked at the tiny measurements Miss Brennan gave him, and something inside him broke. He went to his private stash of wood, a stack of fine, clear cedar he had been saving for a special project. He planed the boards until they were as smooth as silk. He did not rush. Every cut, every joint was a meditation, a prayer. As he worked, tears streamed down his face, silent and hot, splashing onto the pale wood. This was not just a box for the dead, it was an act of love for a life cut short. When the small coffin was assembled, he took out his carving knives. For hours, he sat and carefully carved a single, perfect wildflower into the lid, its petals unfurling as if reaching for the sun. He was a blacksmith, a man of iron and fire, but in that moment, he poured all the tenderness of his giant's heart into the soft wood. The sickness forged a new kind of community in Willow Bend. The old divisions and petty judgments burned away in the heat of shared grief and mutual need. People who had once passed each other on the street with a curt nod were now sharing food, chopping wood for sick neighbors, and watching over each other's children. Ruth was a constant, calming presence in the sick rooms, her skill and her fearlessness earning her a new, deeper level of respect from everyone in the town. They saw her, not as the quiet widow with the scarred hand, but as a pillar of strength. When the worst was finally over, the town came together in the churchyard for a memorial. Reverend Whitaker read the names of the dead, his voice thick with sorrow. Old John Hemlock, Sarah Miller, and little Emma. The whole town wept together. After the service, people came up to Ruth, their faces etched with gratitude. Men who had barely acknowledged her before now wrung her hand, their eyes filled with tears. Women who had whispered behind her back now embraced her, thanking her for saving their child, for comforting their husband. They were no longer just her neighbors, they were her people. In the quiet aftermath of the epidemic, Hugh Morrison began to fade. The winter had been hard on his old bones, and the grief of losing so many friends had taken its toll. One spring afternoon, He called Caleb to his small house behind the forge. "It is time," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The forge is yours, son. Do good work. Be an honest man. That is all I ask." He passed away in his sleep 2 days later. Caleb, with a heavy heart, took down the old, weathered sign that read Morrison Blacksmith. He spent a week forging a new one, shaping the letters with care. It read, simply, Thorn Ironworks. He also took on young Daniel as a full-time apprentice. The cycle was continuing. The torch had been passed. And then, in the midst of sorrow and new beginnings, came a quiet joy. Ruth told him one evening, her hand resting on her stomach, a radiant, secret smile on her face. They were going to have a child. The news was a balm to Caleb's soul, a promise of new life after a winter of death. The future, which had once been a terrifying empty space, now held the bright, shining promise of a family. His joy, however, was soon tempered by a new and powerful fear. One night, midway through her pregnancy, Ruth cried out in her sleep. She was racked with a sudden, sharp pain. Caleb, in a blind panic, carried her to the doctor's house. Dr. Adams examined her, his face grave. It was a false alarm, a premature labor that had thankfully subsided. But the danger was real. He ordered her to bed. She was not to lift anything, not to work in the garden, not to exert herself in any way until the baby came. The doctor's orders plunged Caleb into a dark sea of anxiety. The old feeling, the one that had haunted him his entire life, returned with a vengeance, the feeling of not being enough. He felt utterly helpless to protect his wife and his unborn child. The only thing he knew how to do was work. He threw himself into the forge with a desperate, frantic energy. He took on every job, no matter how small or how difficult. He worked from before sunrise until long after dark, his hammer ringing relentlessly, his body pushed to the limits of its endurance. He was driven by a primal, panicked need to provide, to build a wall of security around his family with his own 2 hands. If he could just earn enough, save enough, work hard enough, then maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. Ruth watched him from her bed, her heart aching. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the fear in his eyes. He was building a fortress, but he was wearing himself down to a shadow in the process. One evening she called him to her bedside. He came reluctantly, his hands stained with soot, his eyes dull with fatigue. "Sit with me, Caleb," she said softly. He sat on the edge of the bed, his large frame seeming to fill the small room. "You are working too hard," she said, her hand covering his. "You are going to make yourself sick." "I have to," he said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "I have to take care of you." She looked at him, her gaze clear and loving. "I do not need a worn-out martyr, Caleb. I need my husband. I need you strong and healthy, not broken and exhausted. Your presence here, with me, is worth more than any amount of money you could earn. We will manage. We will manage together." His shoulders slumped, the tension draining out of him, replaced by a wave of weary relief. He had been trying to carry the world by himself, and she was reminding him that he did not have to. In the weeks that followed, he found other ways to channel his restless energy. In the yard, he built her a small greenhouse, a beautiful structure of glass and cedar, so she could have a place to tend her seedlings without leaving the house. It was a monument to his love for her, a house of life built in the face of his fear. In the evenings, he would sit by her bed and she would read to him. She gave him a journal bound in soft leather. "For you to keep your dreams in," she said. He began to fill it with sketches, with new designs for gates and railings, with ideas for tools and furniture. He was not just a laborer, he was an artist, and she was the first person who had ever truly seen that in him. One quiet night, as they sat in the soft glow of the lamp, a long silence stretched between them. He could feel the familiar anxiety beginning to creep back in, the dark what-ifs that haunted the corners of his mind. Ruth saw the shadow pass over his face. She said nothing. Instead, she took his large, calloused hand and placed it flat against her swollen belly. He held his breath, his hand resting on the warm, tight curve of her. He was about to pull away, feeling clumsy and intrusive, when he felt it, a small, distinct, fluttering kick against his palm. It was a tiny, insistent thump, a secret message from a world he could not see. He looked at Ruth, his eyes wide with wonder. She was smiling, her face serene. He felt it again, stronger this time, a definite nudge, a tap from within. It was a spark of life, a tangible promise. In that moment, the gnawing fear that had consumed him for weeks simply vanished, burned away by the stunning, miraculous reality of that small kick. It was the touch of his child, and it was enough. The baby came with the dawn. The first pains began in the dark, quiet hours before sunrise, and for a terrifying hour. Caleb was a clumsy, frantic giant in his own small home. He stumbled over furniture, built the fire up too high, then let it die down to embers, his mind a chaotic jumble of fear and helplessness. He was a man who could tame fire and bend steel, but the elemental force of childbirth left him feeling like a useless boy. It was Ruth, her face pale with effort but her voice calm and steady, who anchored him. "Breathe, Caleb," she said, her hand gripping his with a strength that amazed him. "Just breathe with me. We will do this together." He sent Daniel, who had been sleeping in the new workshop, to fetch Dr. Adams and Martha Boone. When they arrived, the cottage was filled with a focused, female energy. And Caleb found himself relegated to the kitchen, tasked with the simple, vital job of keeping the water boiling. He paced the floorboards he had laid himself, listening to the muffled sounds from the bedroom, his heart hammering against his ribs in time with the rise and fall of Ruth's cries. He had never felt so large or so powerless. It was Martha Boone who came for him, her face tired but beaming. "Go to your wife, Caleb. She is asking for you." He entered the bedroom, a place transformed by the ordeal into something sacred. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and new life. Ruth lay back against the pillows, her hair damp against her forehead, her body weary, but her eyes were luminous, and cradled in her arms, wrapped in a soft flannel blanket, was the most miraculous thing he had ever seen. A tiny, perfect human being, with a dusting of dark hair and a face as crumpled and beautiful as a new rosebud. "A girl," Ruth whispered, her voice husky with exhaustion and love. Caleb knelt by the bed, his knees weak. He was afraid to touch the baby, afraid his large, rough hands would somehow break something so fragile. Ruth guided his hand, placing his finger into the baby's impossibly small fist. The tiny fingers immediately curled around his, a grip of surprising strength. In that moment, the world shifted on its axis, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the years of feeling like an outsider. All of it washed away, replaced by a wave of love so fierce and protective it took his breath away. He was a father. This was his daughter. "We should name her Emma," he said, his voice thick and unsteady, "for the little girl." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I was thinking the same thing. And Grace, for the gift she is." Emma Grace Thorne. The name settled in the quiet room, a perfect blend of memory and hope. The community of Willow Bend, which had been forged anew by the fires of sickness and grief, now came together to celebrate a new life. A steady stream of visitors came to the small cottage, not with stares of curiosity, but with offerings of food and handmade gifts. The Boones brought a cradle Samuel had built. Mrs. Chen brought a delicate silk blanket embroidered with good luck symbols. The children from the orphanage, led by Miss Brennan, came with a bouquet of wildflowers and stood in a shy, silent circle, gazing in awe at the baby. The cycle of the seasons turned. The summer was warm and bountiful. Caleb's work at the forge prospered. Thorne Ironworks became known throughout the valley for its quality and artistry. Young Daniel, under Caleb's patient tutelage, was no longer a gangly apprentice but a capable young smith, his hammer ringing with a growing confidence. At the end of the summer, the town held its annual harvest festival. It was a joyous affair, a celebration of the earth's bounty and their own survival. The town square was filled with stalls selling produce, baked goods, and handmade crafts. Ruth had a stall of her own. her table laden with the vibrant jewels of her garden, bright red tomatoes, deep green squashes, and jars of glistening preserves. She laughed and talked with the other women, sharing recipes and gardening tips. No longer the quiet widow, but a vital, respected part of the community's fabric. Caleb walked through the festival grounds, carrying Emma Grace in a sling against his chest. He felt a quiet sense of belonging he had never thought possible. He stopped to admire the new iron gates he had forged for the schoolhouse, a project he had undertaken as a gift to the town. A blue ribbon was tied to the intricate scroll work. He had won first prize in the craft competition. As he stood there, a shadow fell over him. He turned and found himself face to face with Margaret Whitmore. He had not spoken to her since the day she had left the church, had barely even seen her. She looked older, her face etched with a permanent disapproval. Her gaze, however, was not on him. It was fixed on the small, sleeping baby on his chest. An awkward silence stretched between them. Caleb felt a flicker of the old shame, the old anger, but it was distant, like an echo from another life. "She is beautiful," Margaret said at last, the words seeming to cost her a great effort. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a brief, unguarded moment of regret. "I was wrong." That was all. There was no grand apology, no lengthy explanation, just those 3 quiet words. But it was enough. Caleb looked at the woman who had caused him such profound humiliation and felt nothing but a distant, quiet pity. She was trapped in a world of her own making, a world of rigid rules and cold expectations. He was free. He simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, not of forgiveness, but of release. He did not need her apology anymore. He turned and walked away, back toward the warmth and laughter of his wife's stall, leaving Margaret Whitmore standing alone with her pride. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, the aspens on the mountainsides turned a brilliant, fiery gold. On their porch, a new piece of furniture appeared. It was a bench built by Caleb from stout, weathered oak, but it was a peculiar bench. It had 2 seats, but one was set several inches higher than the other. When he and Ruth sat on it, a ritual they began every evening at sunset. The strange design made perfect sense. Despite the great difference in their heights, the bench allowed them to sit perfectly shoulder to shoulder, their eyes at the same level as they looked out over the valley. It was a symbol of their life together, a testament to a love that did not require either of them to shrink or to stretch, but had found its own unique and perfect fit. One evening, as the last rays of the sun painted the clouds in shades of rose and violet, Caleb sat on the bench, holding a sleeping Emma Grace in his arms. Ruth was beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. The air was still and cool. In the distance, the bell in the orphanage tower, the tower he had built, stood silent against the darkening sky, a quiet guardian watching over the town. It was no longer a monument to his rejection, but a symbol of his place in the world. He had come to this town a stranger, a man measured and dismissed for his size. He had endured mockery and isolation, but through the steady, honest work of his hands and the quiet, courageous love of a good woman, he had forged something new. He looked down at the precious child in his arms, and then at the woman beside him, his partner, his heart. A profound sense of peace washed over him. The greatest thing I ever forged, he thought, was not made of iron, but a home for our hearts. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.